Hello everyone. In this video we are going to link together a couple of things that we learned in previous videos from the 2012 R2 Mega series and create ourselves a Hyper-V cluster. And since most of the things were already covered, like I said in previous videos, I will not really explain, for example, how to create the iSCSI target part or the loons, or how to connect the loons to the servers. We will just run the commands. And if you want to get a little more details about why I run certain commands, you can view my previous videos where I explain, for example, how to create an iSCSI target server, how to connect to the storage from the iSCSI with a client, and so on. And with that out of the way, in this video we are going to be using a server that in my environment is called BCM01, and that one will be the iSCSI server. And I also have two Hyper-V nodes, HVS03A and HVS03B, and these will be the two cluster nodes. The first thing that we have to do is to prepare the iSCSI storage on BCM01. So I will connect with Powershell remoting on this server. And this block of commands will create two disks, one for quorum and one for data, that we will use in our cluster. And we can run all of them together. And our storage is done. Now the next thing we have to do is prepare the two Hyper-V hosts to connect to this storage. And this means that we have to run on both of them these commands, or for a much faster execution we can use invoke command with all of these commands stringed together, and we run the command on the two Hyper-V nodes. So let's run the invoke command part. And it's already done on both nodes. Now the two disks are linked to the two Hyper-V servers. And one more thing we have to do, of course, to use clustering is to enable the clustering feature on both nodes also. This command is used to enable the feature, and we will use invoke command to run it on both nodes. And it's already done. One more thing that I want to do on both nodes also is to create a Hyper-V switch for testing. So now the same switch is created on both nodes. And the next part will actually be the creation of the cluster, and I will do it really on one of the nodes that will be part of this cluster, because there are a couple of commands that have to be run directly on a cluster node and not through PowerShell remoting. So I will copy this block of code and I will go on my A node from this cluster. So on my A node, let's open a notepad and paste this code, and let's make it just a little bigger, or a lot bigger. Looks good. So the first thing that we have to do when creating a cluster is, of course, to test that we can create the cluster. And this is the command. You have to wait approximately 1 minute or so. And even if you get a couple of warnings, it should not be a problem. The end result should be successful. And you see that it is approved, so we can continue. And with the test done, the next command will actually create our cluster this is the cluster name, these are the two cluster nodes, and I assigned an IP for the cluster object. The cluster is now created. The next command, I want to also run it so that the cluster will also create a reverse DNS entry. And the next part is actually related to the disks. So we have to initialize the disks, format them, and add them to the cluster. I will run the first three commands, so I'm sure that it initializes and formats the disk before I add it to the cluster. Now let's add the disk to the cluster and set this first disk as a quorum disk. Excellent. Now let's move on to the second disk, and I will run the first two commands to make sure that the letter E will be assigned so I don't make a mistake. And it wasn't. We have letter F. Let's use then letter F, and we run the other commands that are left. And this last command will actually use this cluster disk 2 as a cluster shared volume disk. So both nodes of the cluster will use this cluster shared volume at the same time. This is the big advantage of what we are doing here. And when you will migrate machines from one node to another, it will be extremely fast. So more or less now the cluster is done, is configured. Now we just have a couple of things left to do. One thing is to configure some basic HyperV settings. So I want to set the virtual hard disk and virtual machine path to the cluster shared volume that we just created. So you see that when you use cluster shared volumes, each disk will have its own folder, volume 1, volume 2, and so on, which you can rename. And these volumes are accessed at the same time by both, or however many nodes you have in the cluster. Let's run with invoke command on both nodes. And the last thing is to create a virtual machine and add it as a cluster role. And this is done on one of the cluster nodes. It doesn't matter. I'll do it on the A node. So I'm on the A node. Let's create the machine. And for the moment, I have just created a normal virtual machine, even though it's on the cluster share volume. If we connect with HyperV Manager to HVS03A, for example, we see the virtual machine, but there will be no mention of this machine in the cluster manager. So in failover cluster manager, we have no roles. Each virtual machine in a HyperV cluster will be a separate role. To add the machine as a cluster role, we have to use this command, but this has to be run directly on the server. So on the A node, let's run the command, and now it tells us that it's done. So if I now go to HyperV Manager, nothing has changed really, but in a failover cluster manager, we now see the VM as a cluster role. So we were successful. And more or less, this is how you can create and configure a basic HyperV cluster, and only using PowerShell. I think this is a very powerful thing to do, especially for test environments, for example. If you want to quickly set up test clusters. Also in productive environments with automation, I think it's extremely helpful to not waste time or not make mistakes forgetting to set a specific thing. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a like and share it. Also consider subscribing so you are notified when I put out new videos. And I'll see you in the next one.